Today we explore cursed objects found on Halloween. Among costumes and decorations, some objects hide curses, waiting to be unleashed by those who dare to touch them.
The Lost Key.
The night of Halloween was supposed to be just a game, but ever since I found that small key, something dark began stalking me at home. I was 9 years old, and like every Halloween, I went out trick-or-treating with my friends. That night, they let me stay out later than usual because we lived in a quiet neighborhood. I remember we stopped at an old house, the last one before heading back. That's where I found it, among the dry leaves. A small key lying by the entrance. Without thinking, I put it in my bag. Back home, after checking my candy, I remembered the key. It was a strange object to have found in the middle of the street, but my childish mind saw it as a little treasure. I didn't show it to my parents. Something inside me told me I should keep it, that it was a secret just for me. That same night, as I was trying to sleep, I heard a faint sound that seemed to come from the walls, like something was trapped inside. At first I thought it was my imagination, but the sound grew stronger, like someone was scratching the wood. I got up and found the key on the floor of my room. I stood there, confused. I was sure I had left it in my bag, but I thought maybe I had accidentally dropped it. I went back to bed, but just as I was about to fall asleep, I felt it. A presence. Something cold and heavy, like the air in the room had suddenly changed. A whisper, unintelligible, moved through the room. I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping it was all just my imagination. But when I opened them again, something was there. It was a tall, deformed shadow, faceless, with long, twisted limbs that brushed the floor. It moved slowly towards me, each step feeling heavy, resonating loudly in my ears. I was paralyzed. I couldn't scream. I couldn't move. Its figure stopped close to my bed, and I felt it watching me, like it had been searching for me for a long time. Suddenly, my bedroom door flew open and the light from the hallway made it disappear. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I felt watched, but there was nothing else visible. The next day, as I tried to forget what had happened, I found the key in my living room. I couldn't explain it. I was sure I had left it in my bedroom. Every time I tried to get rid of it, it would reappear. Throwing it away didn't work. It always came back as if it was tied to me, and with it, the shadow. Each night got worse. The sound in the walls of my room wouldn't stop. I could feel the coldness of its presence without even seeing it. I told my parents what was happening, but they didn't believe me. They said it must have been my active imagination. I began to doubt my sanity, but I knew it wasn't a dream. The fear was real. One night the sound started earlier than usual. I was already awake, trembling. I knew it was coming. The sound grew deafening, like something was clawing at the walls. This time the figure appeared at the foot of my bed. It was clearer now, its shadow dense and dark, its long hands shaped like claws. I sat up in my bed suddenly, but I couldn't move any further. It was as if something invisible was keeping me trapped in bed. The shadow leaned towards me, so close I could feel its cold breath brushing against my skin. From its non-existent mouth came a sound, a sharp whisper that I couldn't understand. I squeezed my eyes shut and screamed. I heard my parents running down the hallway, but they stopped at the door. I could hear them trying to open it, but they couldn't. Finally, after what felt like hours, the door opened. I saw my father standing in the doorway, shocked, staring at where the shadow had been. The shadow looked at him, let out a sound, something like a growl, and then disappeared. My father didn't say a word. We just packed a few things and left in the car to stay at my grandmother's house that night. The next day, while my grandmother and I were having breakfast, I saw my father arrive. He told me he had buried the key in a remote part of the nearby woods, and that thing would never come back. We never returned to our house, and we stayed living with my grandmother. From that night on, Halloween was never the same. I never knew what that thing was, and even years later, I sometimes think I see the shadow standing in a corner of my room staring at me.
The Forbidden Ring.
Claire shouldn't have put on the ring. As soon as she did, the image of a woman appeared, whispering for us to return what was hers. It was Halloween night, and my friend Claire insisted we go to the abandoned house in the neighborhood. People said no one had lived there for decades, and that something strange was going on inside. We thought it would be fun to explore it, more out of curiosity than actually believing those stories. When we arrived, we saw the door was slightly ajar, so we figured it was the best way in. We slipped through and entered the house. But I immediately felt a strange pressure in my chest, as if the air inside was heavier. We wandered through the house. Everything was covered in dust, and the walls were peeling. It was obvious no one had been there for a long time. We went up to the second floor and entered what looked like a bedroom. There was an old dresser, and as Claire rummaged through the drawers, she found something shiny, a gold ring with a black stone in the center. It looked old, but perfectly preserved, as if time hadn't touched it. Claire was fascinated by the find. Before I could get a good look at the ring, or even say anything, she slipped it onto her finger. Instantly, a freezing wind swept through the room. The windows were closed, but the curtains began to move as if a storm had burst in. I felt a shiver run down my spine, and the lights in the house, which hadn't worked in years, flickered. We looked at each other in silence. Claire nervously laughed and said it had to be a coincidence. We kept exploring, but the noises in the house grew louder. Footsteps on the ceiling, distant whispers, and then suddenly, a creak behind us. I quickly turned around, but there was no one, or at least, so I thought. Claire began rubbing the finger where the ring was. She said it felt strange, as if it were getting tighter and tighter. We tried to take it off, but it wouldn't budge. As we struggled, we heard something even more terrifying. A deep, slow breath right behind us. We froze. We knew we weren't alone. A loud bang on the door made us jump. We ran into the hallway, and before we could reach the stairs, we saw her, a tall, thin woman, dressed in some sort of old-fashioned gown, staring at us from the far end. Her skin was pale, wrinkled, and her eyes, those empty black eyes, seemed to look directly into our souls. She took a step toward us, and the cold in the house grew even more intense. I could feel my whole body trembling. Suddenly, the woman opened her mouth and whispered, "The ring." Her voice echoed everywhere at once. Claire tried to speak, but no words came out. I could only pull Claire back with me as I retreated. But the woman kept coming closer, and in that moment I understood. The ring belonged to her. The woman spoke again. "Put it back where you found it," this time in a stronger tone. And as she did, the doors in the house began to slam shut one by one. Claire started screaming, desperately trying to yank the ring off her finger. The pressure in the air was so intense we could barely breathe. Suddenly, the woman vanished, but not for long. She reappeared in front of us, extending her hand, with thin, bony fingers, demanding the ring. I tried to help Claire remove the ring, and with a strong tug, it finally flew off her finger, landing near the dresser where we had found it. Everything stopped. The woman stood still and, looking at us with her terrifying face, said, "You should not have touched it. before disappearing in front of us. We ran for the front door, stumbling in the process, but we didn't stop. Only when we were outside, under the cold light of the moon, did we manage to breathe again. Claire looked at me, her eyes filled with fear, and without saying a word, we both knew we'd never go back in there. Since that night, I haven't been able to sleep well, and every time I pass by that house, especially at night, I feel her gaze on me, as if she's watching, waiting for someone else to come for her ring.
Cursed symbols.
We should have never taken that board from the cemetery. Ever since then, we've all seen that thing, that entity that haunts us. It all started on Halloween night. My group of friends and I decided to visit the old cemetery on the outskirts of town. There were 5 of us: Alex, Sarah, Jake, Emma, and me. We knew the place was full of ghost stories, but we didn't believe in them. We just wanted to have some fun. We snuck into the cemetery, walking between the gravestones, lighting the ground with our flashlights, when Alex tripped over something strange. Upon closer inspection, we realized it was a wooden board, partially buried in the dirt, with strange symbols carved into its surface. It didn't seem like something that was just there by accident. The wood was old, and the carvings formed a pattern none of us could understand. Jake came up with the idea of taking the board with us as if it were a trophy from our night of exploration. Against my better judgment, we all agreed. No one objected, though something about the board deeply unsettled me. From that moment on, I could feel a presence. Something I couldn't see, but I knew was there, watching us. When we got back home, we stored the board in Jake's garage. That night, I dreamt of faceless shadows, staring at me from every corner of my room. I couldn't move, I couldn't scream. I could only feel their presence, getting closer and closer until I woke up drenched in sweat. The next morning, I found out I wasn't the only one. We had all had the same dream. From that moment, things got worse. Sarah was the first to see it. She was alone at home when, out of the corner of her eye, she saw a tall, thin figure with an abnormally long head standing in her hallway. It vanished when she screamed. But something broke inside her that night. I could see it in her eyes. Always vigilant, always on the edge of panic. Emma started hearing whispers, voices that didn't belong to anyone. She told us the voices spoke in a strange language, one she couldn't understand, but she felt like they were calling her. Alex, the most skeptical of us, was paralyzed one night while standing in front of his bedroom mirror. He said his reflection moved on its own, while he remained still. Since then, he's avoided any surface where he can see his reflection. After a few days, we decided to confront whatever we had unleashed. We went back to Jake's garage where we had left the board, and when we uncovered it, the symbols had changed. They were now deeper, almost as if they had been burned into the wood. That night, we stayed at Jake's house hoping that being together would protect us. However, the entity had no intention of stopping. Around midnight, the lights started flickering and the air turned cold. Almost unbearable. That's when I saw it. It wasn't a shadow anymore. It was there, standing right in front of us. It was tall, much taller than it had appeared in Sarah's visions. Its body was skeletal, and its skin stretched unnaturally tight over the bones. It didn't have eyes, but still, I could feel it watching me. Its jaw was elongated, and it opened as if it was about to speak. But no sound came out. The silence in the room became overwhelming, filling everything. I felt the coldness of its presence, the pressure of something beyond human. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it as it slowly approached us. It raised its skeletal arm toward Sarah, who let out a high-pitched scream that snapped us all into action. We ran in different directions, splitting up without thinking. I could feel it behind me, its hollow footsteps echoing in all directions, but I didn't dare look back. I just kept running until my body couldn't take it anymore. Since then, we haven't spoken about what happened. We've tried to move on with our lives, but what we saw never left us. We never found out what Jake did with the board, nor do we know what happened to him. His parents told us he went to live with his grandmother. As for me, I never went back to the cemetery, and I try not to think about that board or those cursed symbols. But at night, every time I close my eyes, I see that thing, its jaw unhinged, staring at me, and I feel an intense cold as its gaze meets mine. Thank you for journeying with us through the dark passages of these stories. If you enjoyed them, give us a like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss more tales of terror. Until next time, where fear will once again be your companion.